Sandra Bullock stood quietly in the first-class line at LAX, dressed in comfortable travel clothes and a simple baseball cap. Her presence, though understated, caught the attention of a woman in designer clothing who couldn't hide her disapproving glares. The woman, dripping in luxury brands from head to toe, whispered something to her companion while pointing at Sandra's casual attire. What happened next would leave the entire first-class cabin in complete silence and teach everyone an unforgettable lesson about true class. Before we continue with this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy real stories about celebrities who stay humble despite their fame, make sure to subscribe to our channel because tomorrow we have another heartwarming story that will touch your soul. The Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its usual symphony of rolling luggage, rushed conversations, and airport announcements echoing through the terminal. In the exclusive first-class lounge, Sandra Bullock sat quietly in a corner, immersed in a well-worn paperback book. She wore simple black leggings, an oversized sweater, and comfortable running shoes, the practical choice of someone who valued comfort over appearance during long flights. Her face, free of makeup, reflected the natural beauty that had captured audiences worldwide, though today she seemed content to blend into the background. Across the lounge sat Margaret Winchester, a sight that demanded attention. Her Hermes bag occupied its own seat. Her diamonds caught the fluorescent lighting at every turn, and her perfectly coiffed hair suggested hours at an expensive salon. She sat with the air of someone who didn't just belong in first class. She believed she owned it. As Margaret's eyes landed on Sandra, her perfectly painted lips curled into a slight sneer. She leaned toward her companion, her voice carrying just loud enough to be heard. "Can you believe what they're letting into first class these days? I remember when this lounge had standards." Her words hung in the air like expensive perfume, too strong to ignore. Sandra, who had heard similar comments throughout her career, simply turned another page in her book. Her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to Margaret's obvious attempt to draw attention. The tension in the lounge was palpable, with other passengers stealing glances between the two women. What no one noticed was a man in a simple black jacket who had just entered the lounge. His kind eyes took in the scene with quiet interest. His presence would soon turn this seemingly ordinary flight into a moment that would teach everyone present an unforgettable lesson about true class and human dignity. As the first-class passengers began boarding, Margaret made sure she was directly behind Sandra in line, her Louis Vuitton carry-on trailing behind her like a proud peacock's tail. "First class." Margaret's voice dripped with mock surprise as she looked at Sandra's boarding pass. "How interesting." Sandra turned slightly, offering a polite smile that had charmed millions on screen. But Margaret was far from finished. "You know," Margaret continued, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I remember when flying first class meant something, when people dressed for the occasion." She gestured at her own Chanel suit with a self-satisfied smile. Sandra adjusted her baseball cap, her expression serene despite the obvious provocation. The boarding process continued, and as fate would have it, Sandra's seat was directly across the aisle from Margaret's. As Sandra stored her simple backpack in the overhead compartment, Margaret let out an exaggerated sigh. "Darling," she called out to Sandra, her voice honey-sweet but laced with venom, "I think you might have wandered into the wrong section. Economy is further back." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones. Sandra settled into her seat with grace, pulling out her paperback book once again. Her calm demeanor seemed to irritate Margaret even more. "It's just that some of us," Margaret continued, arranging her designer scarf with theatrical precision, "work very hard to maintain certain standards. We pay a premium for a premium experience." She glanced meaningfully at Sandra's casual attire. "Though I suppose not everyone understands that concept." The flight attendant, who had been watching the interaction with growing concern, approached their section with the pre-flight drink service. Just then, the man in the black jacket, who had been in the lounge earlier, made his way down the aisle. He paused briefly, his eyes meeting Sandra's, a subtle smile of recognition passing between them. Margaret, too engrossed in her own performance, failed to notice the silent exchange that would soon turn her carefully constructed world upside down. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when Margaret decided to escalate her campaign. Sipping her champagne with exaggerated elegance, she turned to her companion, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "You know, Sarah, I was just telling Harrison at the country club how standards have fallen everywhere. First class used to mean first class." She shot a pointed look at Sandra. "Now it seems anyone can wander in wearing whatever they picked up at Target." Sandra placed a bookmark in her novel and finally turned to face Margaret directly. Her eyes, though gentle, held a quiet strength that made several passengers lean forward in anticipation. "You seem very concerned about appearances," Sandra said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made Margaret's coldness all the more apparent. Margaret's perfectly maintained smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Well, someone has to maintain standards. I've worked too hard to sit here and watch it all go to," she trailed off as the man in the black jacket rose from his seat a few rows ahead. He turned, and several passengers gasped as they recognized him. Keanu Reeves walked down the aisle with the same understated grace he was known for, stopping right between Sandra's and Margaret's seats. "Hey, Sandy," he said with a warm smile. "I thought I recognized you at the gate." Margaret's face froze mid-sneer as she watched Keanu lean down to give Sandra a friendly hug. "Keanu, I didn't know you were on this flight," Sandra responded with genuine pleasure. The two old friends shared a moment of comfortable familiarity. Margaret's champagne glass trembled slightly in her hand as realization began to dawn. The other passengers, who had been pretending not to watch the drama unfold, now openly stared at the scene before them. Keanu turned to Margaret, his expression kind but firm. "You know," he said, his voice carrying that familiar gentle authority that had captivated audiences for decades. "True class doesn't come from what you wear or how much you spend. It's about how you treat others." "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about standards." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But in my experience, true class has very little to do with what we wear or how much money we spend on tickets." Margaret's perfectly manicured hand clutched her champagne glass tighter as she stared at Sandra Bullock, one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses, sitting right across from her. The realization of who she had been attempting to belittle hit her like a wave of ice water. I didn't," she stammered, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. The flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves, would you like anything to drink?" The formal acknowledgement of their names seemed to echo through the cabin. Other passengers, who had been discreetly watching the scene unfold, now whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads at Margaret's previous behavior. Keanu remained standing in the aisle, his presence both calming and commanding. "You know what's interesting?" he continued, his voice carrying that thoughtful tone his fans knew so well. "Sandy and I have been friends for years, and one thing I've always admired about her is how she never feels the need to prove herself to anyone." He glanced at Margaret with a gentle but pointed look. "True success isn't about showing off or putting others down. It's about lifting people up." Sandra reached out and touched Keanu's arm appreciatively. "Keanu and I learned long ago that the way we treat others is far more important than any designer label or first-class ticket," she added softly. The color drained from Margaret's face as she remembered every cutting remark she'd made. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that she had just spent the last hour trying to humiliate one of Hollywood's most successful actresses while being observed by another. A passenger a few rows back couldn't contain a small laugh. All that fuss about class, and you couldn't recognize real class when it was sitting right in front of you. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin. Margaret's companion, Sarah, slowly slid down in her seat, trying to distance herself from the embarrassing display she had been part of. As the flight continued, Margaret sat in uncomfortable silence, her designer scarf suddenly feeling more like a noose than a status symbol. She watched as Sandra and Keanu chatted quietly, their genuine friendship evident in every casual gesture and warm laugh. What struck her most wasn't their fame, but their complete lack of pretense. Every few minutes, A passenger would discreetly approach their seats, and both stars would respond with genuine warmth and kindness to each request for a quick photo or autograph. The flight attendants, too, received the same respectful treatment, with both Sandra and Keanu knowing them by name after just a few interactions. Finally, as the plane began its descent, Margaret gathered her courage and stood up. Her voice, now stripped of its earlier arrogance, trembled slightly. "Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves, I need to apologize. My behavior was inexcusable." Sandra turned to her with that same gentle smile she had maintained throughout the entire flight. "We all have moments we're not proud of," she replied softly. "What matters is what we learn from them." Keanu nodded in agreement, adding, "Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments." As passengers began to disembark, Margaret watched as both stars helped elderly passengers retrieve their bags from the overhead compartments, treating everyone with the same respect regardless of their seat assignment or clothing choices. The lesson was clear. True class had nothing to do with designer labels or expensive tickets. It was about how you treated others, especially when you thought nobody important was watching. In the end, this first-class cabin had witnessed more than just an embarrassing moment of mistaken identity. They had seen a powerful reminder that real class, real success, and real worth come from within. As Sarah, Margaret's companion, later posted on social media, "Today I learned that you can buy a first-class ticket, but you cannot buy class itself." Thank you, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, for teaching us what true class looks like. If you enjoyed this story of humility and real-life lessons, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Tomorrow, we have another heartwarming celebrity encounter that will remind you that sometimes the biggest stars shine not through their fame, but through their humanity.